Good afternoon, everyone. So thanks again for joining us for the general overview webinar for the FY26 African American Heritage Preservation Program Grant Round. For ease and convenience, we're going to refer to this program as the AAHPP Grant Program during this webinar. So today on this webinar, we're going to be discussing a number of important program components. So that would be eligibility requirements, how to get started on your application, how to best describe your project, how to develop your budget request, the internal administration process, and the criteria used to evaluate and select awarded grants. So first, just some background information on the program. The grant is administered as a collaboration between the Maryland Historical Trust and the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. The grant program provides funds capital projects for properties that contribute to Maryland's African American history and heritage. It's a very competitive grant with an allocation of now $5 million a year. And just to assure everyone, for this fiscal year, we do have $5 million available in funding. This is state funding. So next slide, please. So the grant is funded by state GO bond funds. So the grant can only fund capital work. That means construction and construction-related projects. The maximum grant amount available this year is $250,000, and there is a suggested minimum grant amount of $10,000, but we can accept smaller requests in some cases. We, of course, encourage grantees to request the amount that they need to complete the project, even if that means requesting the $250,000 maximum. Unused funds can always be returned, but most projects that we use all of the awarded funds. So now let's talk about the application timeline. The links to the online application, which the application is only online, will be live on our program website on March 30th. The application is due by 11:59 p.m. on Monday, June 30th of 2025. So we recommend that you please submit your completed application as early as possible in case you encounter any issues. We want to be able to assist you in resolving them before the deadline. But keep in mind that MHT staff, we're not in our office or checking emails that night. We're not going to be up at 11:58 waiting for your call. So if you do run into technical issues, either try to reach out to us ahead of time by submitting ahead of time, or if you do need to submit at 11:58 at night, please send us an email if you run into difficulty that evening to let us know so we can follow up with you the next day to address any technical issues that you might have. We'll do that after the deadline. Grant staff, we do an initial review of all applications that are submitted after the June 30th deadline, and we will reach out to you if you're missing any required documents or information in July or August, depending on when we get to your application. So now my colleague Taylor Means is going to talk about program eligibility.
Thanks, Stacy. All right, so if you're considering applying to the grant program, the first step is to determine whether your proposal is eligible for funding through this grant. So for eligible applicants, the AAHPP grant can be awarded to nonprofit organizations, local governments, business entities, private individuals, and state and federal agencies. If you are a past applicant or past or current awardee, there are no restrictions on reapplying every year. So even though anyone can apply, there are certain eligibility requirements that applicants must meet, which I'll go into next. So applicants must demonstrate that they are eligible to receive a grant from the state. All applicants, except individuals, must be registered with SSTAT and in good standing with the state to apply. Check this website on the slide for your organization or business if you intend to apply. So this will be a clickable link once it is on the website. There's time between now and June 30th to get in good standing with SSTAT if you are not already. Applicants must provide organizational documents in their application. This includes bylaws, articles of incorporation, and proof of nonprofit status from the IRS. If you are a church or a fraternal organization, this may be an umbrella letter from the parent organization. So take the time to locate these documents now. And again, the links from this presentation are found in the grant guidelines and the webinar slides on the program website. So we'll just go over some eligible properties now. Your property does not have to be historic or have any specific historic designation to be eligible. However, it should have a strong connection to African American heritage and history in Maryland. Past awards have gone to a wide variety of sites, including houses, churches, community centers, barns, schools, museums, hotels, and cemeteries. So if you are unsure if your site or project is eligible, please contact grant staff to discuss. In order for your application to be considered, MHT must have consent from the property owner to do the project and their willingness to convey an easement. Not every property will have to convey an easement, but every applicant must submit a signed letter. A property owner consent letter template is available on the program website to download. It must be signed by the property owner and submitted with the application. Even if the applicant is the owner, and even if your property already has an easement with MHT, you must still submit this letter. MHT will use the property listing in the Maryland State Department, the Maryland State Department of Assessment and Taxation, which is SDAT, to confirm the name of the property owner. MHT will then compare this information with what is provided in the letter of the property owner consent. If MHT cannot find your property on the SDAT website, or the information does not match what you have provided, your application may not be considered for funding. So please check to ensure that there are no issues before you submit your application. And so now I'm going to switch it back over to Stacy, and she's going to talk more specifically about eligible activities within the grant program.
Thank you, Taylor. So there are 4 broad categories of eligible activities for this grant program: acquisition, restoration or rehabilitation, new construction, and pre-development. All of the activities that are funded through this program must be construction related. So first, if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about acquisition. So for an acquisition grant, the acquisition of the property must directly contribute to its preservation and protection. Think about why your organization acquiring the property will help preserve it. Acquisition grant applications can also request funding for restoration or rehabilitation projects, or pre-development, or new construction. All of those can be included along with an acquisition. But funding acquisition through the grant requires careful planning. The settlement date and the availability of funding must align closely. A seller must be willing to wait for the funds to be awarded, which will not happen until December of 2025 or early 2026. So please reach out to us to discuss your acquisition application before applying. Next slide. Okay. So the most common application activity that's made through this grant is restoration or rehabilitation projects. If your site is historic, the rehabilitation or restoration work should emphasize the protection of the property and the repair of important or historic features and materials. Rehabilitation work can include the repair of historic siding, masonry repairs such as repointing, foundation repairs, roof repair replacement, structural work, carpentry such as wood flooring, windows, and doors. Work items like accessibility upgrades, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing upgrades, lighting, drainage improvement, and other site work, as well as bathroom and kitchen upgrades, are also eligible under this grant and fall under that broad umbrella of restoration and rehabilitation. New construction is also eligible under this grant program. Whether you're looking to construct a brand new building or put an addition on an existing structure, the grant can fund these types of projects. Even if your site just needs a small outbuilding like a restroom or a pavilion, these projects are eligible for the grant. If you're planning both rehabilitation work and new construction, the grant request really should prioritize the urgent needs of the existing building over the construction of anything new, but that doesn't mean that you can't include both in the request. Pre-development is also eligible for the grant. However, any pre-development activity must be necessary for construction to take place and must inform a construction project. Eligible pre-development activities include construction documents like plans, archaeological surveys, historic structures reports, conditions assessment, structural engineers reports, architectural services, cemetery conservation plans, and more. In some cases, funds are awarded just for pre-development. However, to be competitive, an application should also include some construction work. And those pre-development documents should inform that construction project specifically. So other things to consider in terms of projects specifically. Rehabilitation, restoration, and new construction might necessitate hiring an architect, an engineer, or an archaeologist to develop plans or identify project priorities. So please leave room in your budget for these services. And if you're unclear what type of professional services your project might require, please reach out to grant staff for assistance. When deciding on your grant project, keep in mind the urgency or the need of the work. How will it help the public access or experience your site? The project should be a discrete phase of work. And if you're unsure that your grant project is eligible or competitive, please get in touch with grant staff. Lastly, the goal of the grant is to fund capital-related expenses only, and project work is expected to last at least 15 years. We cannot fund through this grant any work that has already started, so work that's already underway is not eligible for grant funding. However, if you are going to have other work going on at the site funded through a different method, that can be happening and that is fine. But project work that you want funded through this grant cannot have already started. If your site is historic, all work funded by the grant has to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. If you're not familiar with the Secretary of the Interior standards, there are a set of guidelines for work on historic properties that's created by the National Park Service that, as a state agency, MHT is obligated to make its projects follow. In simple terms, your project must protect and retain historic features and materials. For example, the floors and windows in this historic one-room schoolhouse are important to the character of the building. Instead of removing the old materials and replacing with new, by following the standards and repairing and in-kind replacement where they're deteriorated beyond repair, we really get a sense of the place and the history of this site. We, as a staff, will help make sure that your project meets those standards, but if you have questions about that, please reach out to the grant staff so we can talk about how your project can meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. So we also need to talk about ineligible costs. Not all work is eligible for funding through this grant. There's a list of ineligible expenditures for the grant on this website, but it's not exhaustive. It includes the costs that we are frequently asked about. So this includes things like legal fees, insurance, staff salaries, research, things like master plans and feasibility studies, maintenance, temporary exhibits, landscaping, and work that is not bid per the program policy. So a list that's more complete of ineligible and eligible costs can be found in our grant guidelines, which can be found on our website. And I think there'll be a link put in the chat today. Next slide. So we're going to talk about religious properties now. If you're applying for a grant for a religious property, you'll need to carefully consider your scope of work. While this grant can fund work at most religious sites, buildings used for religious purposes are primarily funded for exterior or structural work. This is because interior spaces that are used for religious purposes are ineligible for funding from the state. Work on features that contain religious imagery, such as stained glass windows, are also not eligible for funding. So work on spaces like hallways, bathrooms, and kitchens are generally eligible. So if you're requesting funds for things like HVAC or electrical upgrades, those systems, we can cover systems that only work in spaces that are not predominantly used for religious purposes. So if you are looking to fund work to a religious site, please reach out to us with questions so we can help you tailor your scope of work to be eligible. Cemeteries are also eligible for this program. Examples of cemetery projects include the repair and resetting of markers, the identification of burials through ground penetrating radar or other survey methods, a cemetery conservation plan, and the repair or installation of paths, walls, fences, and parking areas. Religious sites can combine work to historic places of worship and cemeteries as well. Now Taylor is going to talk to you more specifically on how to get started on your application.
Great. So let's talk about, like Stacy said, how to get started on your application and specific application questions. So some new information for the fiscal year 2026 cycle. MHT is transitioning its grant management software. So this means that all applicants, including returning applicants, must create a new username and password using the proper link to the application. This year, you will see separate application links for individuals and organizations. Returning applicants and grantees can still access their applications from previous years through the old grant system. To assist applicants with the new system, MHT has posted tips and troubleshooting materials on their main grants website page. So please ensure that you are using the correct link this cycle. So we suggest that applicants review the sample application and grant guidelines on the website and identify items that will take time to put together, like the letter of property owner consent, letters of support, and getting estimates to develop your budget. You can use letters of support from other grant programs or from last year's round if you're looking for funding for the same scope of work as outlined in the letters. Your letters must be signed and they must not be older than a year, or they will not be acknowledged. 2 to 6 individual letters of support are sufficient. However, if you would like to show support from a larger group, consider putting together a petition instead of submitting individual letters. We recommend that applicants familiarize themselves with any other state and local regulations, permits, or reviews that your project might need. For example, does your project need to go in front of Historic Preservation or Planning Commission? These reviews may impact your project timeline, so ensure that you are doing further research about your project when applying. When developing your project, it's important to ask yourself, what type of project do you have in mind? Is it an acquisition? Is it a rehab? Think about what the most competitive project for your site will be and reach out to us to discuss it. What is the highest priority or most urgent work to focus on? Please don't ask us for flooring repairs if the roof is leaking, or a new addition if your foundation is disintegrating. We need to make sure to leave your property in a better state than when the project started. Many applicants forget to include architectural and engineering services in their scopes and estimates. The first step for many projects is to get a conditions assessment from a structural engineer to identify critical issues and develop priorities. Others need to hire an architect to develop plans. So if you're planning work that may impact a cemetery or archaeological site, ground penetrating radar or an archaeological investigation may be necessary ahead of the bricks and mortar project. So this is something the grant can fund. So if your building hasn't had any structural evaluation, you should include this in your scope of work. And you can reach out to grant staff if you are unsure. If the project is going to cost more than a maximum grant amount allowed, which is $250,000, or take longer than 2 years to complete, think about breaking down the project into phases. In the application, provide at least 10 photos of your property and project areas. This includes providing photo captions or brief descriptions. This year, applicants can use the photo template, which is available on the website and can be downloaded in the application to submit photos. There isn't space to upload individual photos in the application, so please make sure to use this template. Be sure to provide photos that show the work described in the construction project description section. The photos submitted should show the project areas and how urgent the work is. Include an overall image of the project property that provides the grant reviewer with context, along with close-up photos of the site's deteriorated features, which should clearly show the urgency of the project. Photos of your property may be used for promotional material and announcing awards, so make sure they are clear and impactful. Construction project description is one of the most heavily weighted sections of the application. You will be asked in the application to describe your project. This is the section where you will describe the larger version of your project. Are you hoping to construct a new visitor center for your museum and want the grant to fund pre-development? This is where you would talk about all the phases of the project from pre-development through construction. Be clear and concise about what the project entails and what you're asking the grant to fund. Consider the following questions while developing your project description. Is the work eligible? Is this a discrete phase of work that can be completed with the funds requested? Is the description clear enough for grant reviewers to understand? Make sure all the work described in this section matches the line items in your budget spreadsheet. The grant project scope of work is where you will lay out the specific work items you want the grant to fund. In the construction project description section, you will talk about your entire construction project, even work the grant is not funding. The work you are requesting grant funds for should be listed under the grant project scope of work question. This should match the line items in your budget spreadsheet. And you can see an example of a construction project description and grant project scope of work on screen. But again, if you are unsure, please reach out to grant staff. When developing your budget, please provide an estimate for the grant scope of work. One estimate is sufficient for a service, and they are typically free. Don't forget to include estimates for pre-construction services like building conditions assessments, archaeological drawings, ground penetrating radar, or archaeological investigations if your organization doesn't already have these documents on hand. Please upload all estimates to your application. Once you know how much each service will cost, you'll be able to identify project priorities and if other funding resources are needed to complete the project. Decide if your organization can manage this project or if hiring a project manager is needed to help successfully execute the project. Grantees cannot pay themselves for project management, so consider whether project management is beyond your organization's capacity. In your budget, you would want to include a line item for a project manager. This can also be an estimate received from architect or general contractor. Before submitting your budget request, please ensure that all items listed in the scope of work section are included in the budget. Grant award requests must be made in $1,000 increments, not the exact dollar amount from your estimate. You'll want to include a little buffer to account for price increases or additional project needs. Again, this year, no match is required for this grant. If you are receiving other funds for the project, please identify their source and amount. Whether you've done your own fundraising or working on a bond bill, or if you have applied for or received other grant funds, please include these in your application so the committee can see the level of funding your project has and make note of other state funding sources in case they may impact how you use this grant fund. If you have other state funds, please note that they cannot pay for the same service as AAHPP funds. So please contact grant staff if you have multiple sources of state funding and we'll work with you. So here's an image of the budget spreadsheet you will fill out for your project. You can download it from the program website or from the application. You can also find the sample in the grant guidelines. Please upload your project budget spreadsheet to the application as an Excel file, not as a PDF or any other file format. Please upload it as an Excel file. As you can see on the screen, there are 6 columns in the budget spreadsheet. The first is the item number. You can add as many items as your project includes. The second column includes each work item you want to fund. Then the third column with the green header is where you will list the funds you're requesting from this grant, which is again up to $250,000. In the next blue column, you can list other state funds you're receiving. This includes bond builds and MHAA grants and what work they will cover. Lastly, in the other projects funds column, you can list funds from non-state sources, and this includes funds from like fundraising or income. Use the last column to total each line item. Projects that will be ready to start after awarded are preferred and would make your application more competitive. When putting together your project schedule, consider these questions and refer to the grant guidelines for more information. Your project schedule should take into consideration project phasing, your site schedule, local reviews and permits, MHT approvals, and the procurement process required for this grant. Specific considerations include the timing of on-site events like festivals and memorials, and regular operational schedules and seasonal rentals. If your project requires special local approvals or needs approval from the MHT Easement Committee, these processes should be incorporated into your timing. It's also important to keep in mind that all work this grant pays for must be competitively bid through a process approved by MHT, which can take 30 days to complete. Please know your project won't start right away. However, we anticipate that most projects can be completed within a 2-year period. There's a sample timeline in Exhibit 2 of the grant guidelines that you can customize for your project. Another heavily weighted section of the application is the urgency of the project. Is your site threatened by development or demolition? Is there a major roof leak or crack in the foundation? Has a significant property finally come up for sale? Would your project be ready to start as soon as funding is awarded? Why should your project be prioritized for funding this year? It is important that you really showcase the sense of urgency for your project. Another heavily weighted section of the application is historical and cultural significance. In this section, you will want to write a brief yet compelling narrative about how your site conveys the African American experience in Maryland. Assume grant reviewers are not familiar with your site and share the most significant pieces of your sites or organizations. If you're landmark designation reports, MIHP forms, or National Register nominations, you can include the most important portions in your submission. Be sure to share any historical and cultural information beyond what is available in these documents. The meaning of a place to its community can change over time, so be sure to explain what the property means to the community today. In this section, you will also want to address how your organization uses your site to share African American history and culture with the public. What types of public programming does your organization provide? What will the grant-funded project allow your organization to do that they cannot now? For example, can grant funds help your organization fix the roof on your building so you can host events or provide space for a museum display? In this section, you will also need to address the public benefit your site provides to the broader community. Are you a church who prepares meals for the needy in your community, but you need more space for a larger kitchen? Is your historic site in need of accessibility upgrades so more people can access the site? It's important to highlight how your site or organization provides a public benefit or educational experience that enhances the knowledge of African American history and culture in Maryland. While all applications that are considered by the review committee meet the basic eligibility requirements of the program, applications need to have well-developed significance, education, and public benefit sections to complement a strong scope of work to be competitive. So now I'm going to switch it back to Stacy, and she will talk more about the grant administration aspect of the program.
Thank you. So in this section, we're going to talk about the grant administration schedule, grant paperwork, and conveying an easement. So the application will be available on our website on March 30th, and it is due by 11:59 p.m. on Monday, June 30th of 2025. By late December of 2025, we anticipate announcing the grant awards. Since we're working with a 2-year timeline, the anticipated project completion date is December of 2027. For those projects that are required to convey an easement, it does take additional time to complete that grant paperwork and convey the easement. So those projects will not start right away. Funds are not dispersed until the preservation easement is conveyed. So we're going to talk a little bit about easements, which we have mentioned a little bit earlier, but let's talk more specifically about them. The Maryland Historical Trust may take a historic preservation easement on your property if a grant is awarded. If your property already has an easement, the easement may be modified if an award is accepted. Only historic properties that are listed or eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places are considered for easements. Go to the next slide, please. So what is an easement? If you're not familiar, an easement is a legal contract between MHT and the historic property owner. The easement is recorded in the local land records and stays with the property for a set amount of time. The easement helps protect buildings, structures, and associated archaeological resources on the property. It requires MHT approval of work on your property before it begins. The easement boundary, or parts of the property the easement will protect, is determined by MHT easement staff after the application deadline and before the award announcements are made. For your grant application, we're going to talk about the owner responsibilities of an easement. For properties where MHT does take a preservation easement, the property owner must notify MHT of any proposed changes to any part of the property that is protected by the easement and obtain approval before work is undertaken. The owner must maintain the property in good condition. Insurance may be required to convey an easement, but this cost is not covered by grant funds. So for your grant application, in the property owner letter of consent, where you prove that the owner of the property agrees to the project, they're also going to agree to the conveyance of an easement to the MHT. Since the easement must be conveyed before work begins or grant funds are dispersed, it may add to your timeline. Legal fees related to drafting the easement are not eligible for these grant funds since they're not capital work. These fees vary depending on the size and complexity of your property. A previously recorded webinar about easements can be found on MHT's YouTube channel, and webinar slides are on our website. You can also find information about the MHT easement program using the website link on the slide or emailing directly to them. Last year, I think we had a number of properties that already had easements apply, and the 2 additional easements were taken. So the majority of our properties don't have easements taken, but some of them do. So it's important to keep that in mind. What else should you know if you're going to apply for this grant? If you're awarded a grant, all work must be approved by MHT before construction starts. Grant funds can only pay for contractors hired through a competitive procurement process approved by MHT. MHT can only pay the grantee directly, who will then be responsible for paying their contractors. Payments are made for completed work or deposits on approved contracts. For grants over $200,000, grantees must document their effort to solicit MBE contractors. And if you're awarded, your project monitor will work with you on the procurement process. So please keep that in mind. This is a big thing that people need to consider, that you do need to do a competitive process if you're awarded grant funds. So we'll wrap up this section to talk about the selection process and grant selection criteria. Next, okay. There are multiple selection criteria used to rank your application. There's more information in the grant guidelines and the scoring rubric about how the criteria is considered for each section of the application. As we've mentioned previously, the most heavily weighted sections are significance, public benefit, and the project description. So the grant selection process. After the deadline of June 30th this year, grant staff will review all the applications that are submitted and confirm program eligibility. If your application is missing an attachment, or if we need more information about your organization, we will reach out to you over the summer. So please be sure to use the email address and primary contact in your application. Please make sure that is someone who is prepared to respond to emails over the summer. In the fall, eligible and complete applications will be provided to the Grant Review Committee to rank and review. Recommended projects will be presented to the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture and the Maryland Historical Trust Board. Finally, the Secretary of Planning will make the final approval, and award notifications are emailed in December. A full timeline of this is also available in the grant guidelines. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Taylor, who's going to close out with some helpful application tips and resources.
All right, thank you, Stacy. Successful applications provide clear goals for the project and demonstrate how your organization's goals align with the goals of the Maryland Commission of African American History and Culture and the Maryland Historical Trust. Reviewers want to understand how your project or property will be sustained over time. Reviewers also appreciate understanding the level of community support your project has. So don't forget to ask for and submit letters of support from your community leaders. Make sure that you're familiar with the grant guidelines and scoring rubric so you don't miss any critical sections of the application. Finally, make sure that your application contains clear and concise responses to each question so it's easy for reviewers to understand all aspects of the project. Don't leave any sections blank. Take time to review the sample application online and type your answers in a Word document before starting your online application. The system does have a time limit, so you do need to save your work. So on the screen, you can see our website where you can get basic program information, create a new application by selecting the green individual or organizational FY26 application button, and access an old application or award through the blue pre-FY26 applications and awards button. You can also reach guidelines and resources page from here. But again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to grant staff and we can assist. If you plan to apply, you'll want to visit the guidelines and resources page under for grant applicants. You can download the documents you will need for the application, including the grant guidelines, budget spreadsheet, sample grant application, the property owner letter of consent, the photo template, a tip sheet for creating a new account in the online grant application portal, the AAHPP application quick start guide, and the DNR form if your project is on a state-owned DNR property. So you can see where that is located on the screen here. Under trainings and webinars, you can find links to webinars and slide decks from this and other related presentations. You can also learn more about past awardees to see what types of projects have received AAHPP grants over the past 5 years. So a very useful page. So lastly, we know that this is a lot of information, so thank you very much for sticking with us throughout this webinar. On the screen, you'll find the contact information for Stacy and myself. Please reach out if you have any questions about this program or potential application. Thank you again. Thank you for sitting with us during this webinar, and we wish you the best of luck. But if you have any questions,